Well, with your permission, I may start a little early. Is that okay?
Yep, that's good.
So, you're ready? I have so much material, there's probably no way I can get through it. Please ask me your questions afterwards if there's time. I may be running to mass, but there's just so much here. Most of us don't understand this or don't comprehend this, but in American history, Catholicism was most at home in the American South. And that sounds so counterintuitive to our experience. Because after the Civil War, there was an enormous migration north by Catholics, and so that became a very Catholic-friendly part of the country. But initially, it was the opposite. And so we're here to talk a little bit about Catholicism and its history in the South. And as Georgia, as a colony, a British colony, an English colony, we inherited a lot of anti-Catholicism from the mother country, our Protestant neighbors. But before we were a British colony, we were a Spanish colony. And so we're here to talk a little bit about that history before we move into, let's see, if I can figure this out. Very good. So one of the first colonies founded in North America, if not the first, was founded in Georgia. Now it failed, right? So you've got this fellow by the name of Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon, and they kind of bounce ashore in what is today South Carolina. They go 200 miles or so south, and they end up settling in Georgia, or what is today Georgia. And they named this new area Tierra de Ayllon, which I think is a beautiful name. So, the first settlers here who were from Europe were Spanish Catholics. And they settled on the feast day of St. Michael. And so the settlement was called San Miguel de Guadalupe. And they encountered there the Wale tribe, which we hear about later with our 5 Georgia martyrs. The very first book written and in what is today the United States of America was a catechism written in the Wale language. And this was a Georgia tribe. And part of our problem is, and it's not, I don't know if it's a problem, part of our challenge is so many Catholics move here from so many parts of the world. And so we come and we think, well, the Catholic Church didn't get here till I got here, right? And so we have a very futuristic perspective. We're not coming into an ancient Catholic place. And so a lot of the Catholics who are here don't know their Catholic history in the state of Georgia. And in part that's because secular historians ignore Catholic history and Catholic historians ignore Georgia history. So we're here to try to alleviate some of that. The very first baptism in the United States took place in what is today Macon, Georgia, across the river from Okmulgee Indian Mountains. That was in 1540. And that was on the DeSoto expedition. And if you know anything about the DeSoto expedition, it depends on which historian you're talking to, and they'll draw this map many different ways. But we know that they came through Georgia. The 5 Georgia martyrs are on our wall back there. They're on the wall in the narthex of the church. And we won't talk about them because we talked about that at length before, and there's a new movie coming out, which will be on EWTN February 4th, I believe, and it's about the Georgia martyrs, and yours truly is in it. But anyway, these are some of the earliest, if not the earliest, martyrs of faith in what is today the United States of America. And they ministered to the Wale people who lived on some of the barrier islands off the coast of Georgia. Georgia has 100 miles worth of coastline, and yet it has, I think, a third of the marshes on the East Coast. So it's a very beautiful but kind of hostile, weird place, right? So even today, because of Jimmy Carter and other things, we have I think there are like 3 Navy islands that are developed, and even that's a limited development, right? So it's a very, it feels like it did 500 years ago. And, it was a difficult place to settle because it didn't have so much of an intercoastal building. It had barrier islands and then 4 to 6 miles of marshland. Some of the great islands that we know in Georgia, St. Simon's Island, this is where one of the Georgia martyrs was martyred, Francisco de Maristola. And so in time, Georgia becomes a buffer colony to the Spanish. The Carolinas were wealthy, and they didn't like the Spanish Catholics. And so they began to enslave the Wale and the various Catholic tribes that had been converted by the Spanish missionaries. And they wanted to empty out the coast of what is today Georgia. And they pretty much did. So the Catholic native indigenous people went south to St. Augustine and then even to Havana, or they went to Tallahassee. And the Spanish missions disappeared. And it was almost an empty coast when Oglethorpe settled it. Oglethorpe's an interesting guy. His parents had been Catholic. He was actually named after the last Catholic monarch in England. And his parents had been sort of guarding the doors as a Roman Catholic priest brought Charles II into the Catholic Church on his deathbed. So they were hyper-Catholic. James, their youngest son, was kind of very secular. He was very, very English. He practiced no Catholic faith. And so he was put in charge of this colony that was supposed to buffer the very rich South Carolinians from the Spanish Floridians. The civilized tribes, by the way, usually meant the Protestant tribes, right? They were the ones that, and there was an arms race going on in the backwoods of Georgia, and because the Catholic missionaries did not want to give the Wale rifles, they didn't want to pull them into an international war, but the British did. And so it was, it was happening locally, but it was also a global, global war. There are 2 battles that you probably need to know. Let's see, that's Oglethorpe. One is the Battle of Bloody Marsh and Gully Hole Creek. You can tell this is, the low country, right? But that's where they grew. And so then they set up this, they had a kind of idealized utopian sort of dream. Oglethorpe did, and it failed miserably. And so it became a royal colony after that. And in the royal colony, I'm going to read you part of their charter. It says, "And for greater ease and encouragement of our loving subjects, and such others as shall come to inhabit our said colony, we do by these present before us our heirs and successors, grant, establish, and ordain, that forever hereafter there will be liberty of conscience allowed in the worship of God to all persons inhabiting, or which shall inhabit, or be resident within our said province, and that all persons except papists, right, shall have a free exercise of religion." Okay, so once it becomes a British colony, Catholicism is excluded. And there's an oath of transubstantiation that's made by anybody who's participating in government, which none of us in this room could say. Because if on George Washington, when he went out west in what is today Pittsburgh, in the French and Indian War, he had to swear an oath that there was no such thing as transubstantiation. It was an odious sort of oath that only Protestants could ever swear by. So they excluded Catholics. Just a great map of a little bit of what is Georgia. We think of Georgia as this big state. You have to think of it as the coast, and then that little stretch going up the Savannah River. That's initially what it was. It became big. In the American Revolutionary War, there was the siege of Savannah, and this is important. First of all, it's one of the top 5 deadliest battles in the American Revolutionary War. But it was really important because there were French and Haitian men engaged on the side of the American revolutionaries against Great Britain. So there were people of color from Haiti, and there were French people from France fighting for American independence in the Battle of Savannah. They lost. And they lost, and it was, I think 500 ended up dead. But it was beginning to turn the hearts of some of these anti-Catholic colonists, right? Because something like 5,000 people had fought for the liberation of Savannah and lost. And another thing you have to keep in mind is there was another Catholic by the name of Mr. Pulaski, Casimir Pulaski, was a count, and he is the father of the American cavalry. He was also Roman Catholic. And he died in the battle, or he died from a wound that took place in the battle. He died a couple of days later, and he's buried in Savannah. Another Catholic. And this is a guy who had saved Washington's life once. He was somebody who was significant. So you're starting to see Catholic players in the American Revolution, even in Georgia. And this is a really interesting case. This is Governor Richard Howley. We have 2 historians who come to this parish to give lectures. One of them is David Clayton, Roman Catholic, Knight of Columbus, and a historian, teaches at the university. The other is same pedigree, Roman Catholic, Knight of Columbus, teaches history at the university. And his name is Adam Tate. And they're both on this because in doing my research, I found this on the Georgia governor's website, that this governor, Howley, was Irish, was governor for like a year, right, in the Revolutionary War, because Savannah had fallen, everything moved to Augusta. He was governor for just a bit, but he was Catholic. And so I have them on it. They literally have, and I'm not kidding, they have historians in Lisbon and in Seville, in Seville and in Louisiana working on this. So everybody's trying to prove this, because I was like, I've never heard this before. But if it ends up true, we'll have a portrait of it painted for the hall. So after the American Revolutionary War, because we all need to know about it, there was an establishment of the church, Catholic Church, in the United States of America, and Baltimore became the first diocese. And because Georgia was part of those 13 original states, we were under the Diocese of Baltimore. If you turn around and look at the back, you'll see the coat of arms of Baltimore on the wall back there. So we enter into this period of history where a lot of Catholics from Maryland was pretty much, it took a hard grunt in the American Revolutionary War. And a lot of those people moved to Georgia, in part because Georgia was one of the first of the states to accept because the original Articles of the Federation were not necessarily pro-Catholic or pro-religious liberty, but with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, suddenly that opened up places in the South. And so a lot of these families came, and a lot of them were English recusant families, These were people who had suffered under Catholicism in England for generations. And a lot of them would move to Maryland first, and then they would migrate south to Locust Grove. And there's a painting of Locust Grove in the lobby of this building. And they came and they established this little village. They had plantations and farms, and they were building everything out of logs. And you have to understand, there's no railroad, right? These are people who've just come here, rattling through mud on a wagon to establish this little community. And they built a church, and they didn't even have a priest. And so they would end up petitioning Archbishop Carroll in Baltimore to see help send us a priest. There's just so much I could tell you about this place. I took a photograph of every tombstone in there, and a lot of them were probably wooden tombstones. A lot of them are lost. But the ones that are there, you can see their names. And a lot of them, you have the old English families, and you have the Irish families, and then you have the French families. And there are African Americans who were slaves there. I'm sure all of this had wooden markers, but they're not there anymore. We're working with the Purification Heritage Center to try to get a monument for the African American slaves, the Catholics who were buried there. So there's a lot going on in that little cemetery. And I took photographs of all those tombstones and did a lot of research as much as I could on them, and I could tell you stories about almost all of them that we would be here forever. So, but this is George's first parish. And the painting that you see in our lobby here is a clapboard church. That's the second church. The first church was a log cabin. Now, first came the English, and then the Irish and the French. And they're kind of almost like this. They established a school wherever Catholics go today. We sort of established schools. The locust tree, by the way, this is the locust tree. Very beautiful. The log cabin's missing. It's gone. We don't even know exactly where it is, where it used to be. But the school started early on, almost at the same time that the parish was founded. But it's really kind of a mission, right? Priests come and then they go, and then maybe somebody comes and then goes. So it's not really a parish. But in January of 1821, Bishop John England began to visit Locust Grove. Now, he is the new Bishop of Charleston. That's the second shield you see back there. And the Diocese of Charleston, you have to understand, when he became Bishop of Charleston, I think there were like 3 or 4 parishes, maybe in the entire 4 states that he oversaw. And one of them was Locust Grove, right? And so this man got on a horse and rode out to Locust Grove, and he blessed the new clapboard building that we see hanging in the narthex, right? And he visited there over 13 times during his ministry. He really loved that little parish, and he was very impressed by the level of catechesis that these people had. And it's the Feast of the Purification, right? Candlemas, so we're about to have Candlemas. So when we celebrate Candlemas here at Area Queen, it's kind of a little bit of a birthday for us. The second period of this, by the way, this sweet little bottle is made by one of our ministers, Andrew Hayward. And he just gave that to the Purification Center. That's a model of what the little church looked like, and again, it's not there now. So the church moves because the railroads come in, and so the congregation moves their church to Sheridan, which is 6 miles away or something. It's not far. But they move the building, the old clapboard building. They move it, and then they worship in that for a while, and then they tear it down, and then they build this one. So this is, I guess you could call it the third period of that first parish. The person who blesses this building, we're going to see him again, is Bishop William Gross. And he was the Bishop of Savannah, and that's the third crest you see back there. And he was like the Bishop Byrd of his day. He was recognized all over the country as sort of, the great bishop, the silver-tongued bishop. He ends up eventually moving to Oregon. He does not die in Savannah, but he is in Savannah for a while. And he was Redemptorist. And the Redemptorists are the ones who bring with them the 40 hours devotion, which we'll start in, we do at the beginning of Lent. And he had actually come to Georgia a number of times as a Redemptorist missionary to preach at the Purification Center in the old place. And now he was there to bless the new movement. Okay, so a lot of the early clergy in what is today Georgia were French. And this is a you're not sure who's keeping the records, because is this the Diocese of Baltimore or the Diocese of, Charleston or the Diocese of Savannah, and it's kind of like everything's in flux. Meanwhile, the whole world is in flux because you have the French Revolution going on. And if you know anything about the French Revolution, it's terribly anti-clerical, anti-Catholic, anti-Christian. And so a lot of our clergy end up being exiles from France. And they come and they stay a while, but then, maybe some French people move over here, and then they'll go over there, and then another. So it's they're responding to the crisis of the day. But it's important for us to remember that, and it's hard again to find records on it. But the first priest in residence for our little Purification church would be Father Jean Letmond. And he served there for about a year. And then there was the first pastor, and he was Father Oliver Lemercier. And he ends up, I think, going and starting the cathedral, what is now the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Savannah. So that beautiful church in Savannah is not the first church, Catholic church, in Georgia. It isn't. But the French were fleeing the French Revolution. They were fleeing the Haitian uprising, and they were coming to places like Savannah, and they needed clergy. Something like, believe it or not, 30,000 priests were killed or exiled in the French Revolution. And if you look up here, this flag that's closest to the back, that's the flag of the Vendée. A lot of our French clergy came from that region. And so we kind of have, that flag represents those early waves of French Catholics. There's also a French colony around St. Mary's, just right on the border of Georgia and Florida, across from Cumberland Island. So you just get the sense of like they're fleeing chaos, and they're finding refuge in Georgia. And one great example of this, if you've ever seen the movie Gone with the Wind, is Ellen O'Hara. She is she's the main character's mother, and she's French, right? And she marries an Irishman. So you start to see, it's like the Irish and the French are coming, they're both Catholic. She's a fictional character, but she represents that whole period. So the Bill of Rights, brings in a new reality. We have the Diocese of Charleston established, and we have Bishop England coming again to bless the first church in Locust Grove. And he, by the way, started the first newspaper, Catholic newspaper in the country. He was, I think he addressed the joint houses of Congress. I mean, he was considered a very learned man, and he was Irish. He was very scholarly and very, his name is England, but he was Irish. And he was kind of the rock star of the bishops for a while. And you just don't think about that in relationship to, he's Taliaferro County. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, I always do. But, it's just such a remote place now, but it was not at the time. So the Irish Catholics came, they were fleeing persecution. They were escaping rebellions and the potato famine, which was basically genocide. Right? I mean, no one had to starve them. And one of the things that was happening in Irish law, as I understand it, they could not leave their property to one child. So if you had 200 acres, you couldn't leave all 200 acres to the eldest son. You had to divide it equally. And then the next generation had to divide it equally. And what that did over time is it just turned everybody into serfs, right? Impoverished. And so when the Irish come to America, they can buy land. And so you see like Gerald O'Hara in the movie Gone with the Wind. He's waxing on about the love of the land. That's part of it. This is a little known fact. We used this at a cocktail party, and there he is, Mr. O'Hara. Again, he's a fictional character, right? But interesting. But once the Diocese of Savannah was established, all the Catholic parishes, I think there were 3 of them in the state, made a convention. And they chose a patron saint for the state of Georgia. And they chose St. Peter. I think that's interesting. So, Holy Trinity is one of the older churches in the state. It's the one that was in Augusta, and the building is actually antebellum. It's the second oldest parish, Catholic parish in the state. And it was used as a hospital during the Civil War. And Washington looks in that area, which is such an interesting part of Georgia. That's where they have, that's close to Locust Grove and Sharon. And that's where a lot of Catholics moved to that part of Georgia. And it was a highly patriotic part of Georgia. One of the American Revolutionary battles that took place in Georgia took place there. And they named that city Washington after General Washington, not after President Washington. The Revolutionary War was still going on. So it's a very patriotic part of Georgia. Atlanta. It is a lake, and it is not Charleston, and it is not Savannah, and it never was. It was a railroad town. It was called Terminus for a while, and then Marthasville. It's the westernmost town. We hardly think of Georgia as being a western town, but you have to understand, when people went west, they had to first go south. They had to go south and hook around the Appalachian Mountains, the Blue Ridge, and then they could go west. So Georgia was Atlanta was a western town. And it started kind of as a shanty town with railroad workers and prostitutes, but it quickly grew wealthy. And it became a place of industry, and it became more respectable. But it was something of a frontier, upstart frontier town, and it was filled with saloons. And you can sort of see, again, if you ever watched Gone with the Wind, it's like, Atlanta's kind of, it's like the Vegas of Georgia. It was a boom town from the beginning. It was filled with people from all over the world from the beginning. Nobody was almost native to it from the beginning. So, and it was a melting pot. And it was surrounded by plantation culture, but it was not really ever the Old South culturally. It had not been in favor of secession before the Civil War. Even today, people out in the hinterlands in Georgia look at Atlanta as something of a, they're not so sure it's Georgia. But of course we know it's Georgia, but there are no like historical districts in Atlanta. It's just it's always just sort of reinventing itself. And it's important to keep in mind that a lot of times Catholicism was in the home. Because as people were moving west, they were outrunning the priests. The priests could not keep up. The bishops could not keep up. And they would go and they'd start something, and then they'd get a courthouse and almost railroads, and they'd move west. So a lot of times Catholicism in Georgia was like Catholicism in Ireland and in England. Because there had been almost a rule against public worship, it became very devotional, and it became very sort of familial. A lot of times there were weddings in homes because there were no churches. Priests would go and say Mass in homes. This is one of the earlier churches. This is in Albany. Sweet little thing. So one of our bishops in Savannah was Jean-Marcel Pierre Auguste Barreau, French. And he is from Le Puy in France. And that is where and he had studied with the Sulpicians. So when he comes to Georgia, he begins a connection with the Sisters of Le Puy, and we'll see that a little further. He does, again, a lot of times they would come to Savannah, and then they would move somewhere else. He came to Savannah, and he moved to St. Augustine. But he is the one who invites the Sisters of Mercy of Le Puy into Georgia and into the South. Whilst Atlanta was under siege in the Civil War, the priest and the parish that's on the wall in there that you see in the lobby, Father Thomas O'Reilly and the priest before him, were ministering to the Catholics and non-Catholics. And they were ministering to Catholics on both sides of that battle, of that war and conflict. And they used the church as a hospital. Father Imran Bliemel is the very first Catholic chaplain to die on the battlefield. in the United States, in what is today the U.S. He had fought for, he was serving the Confederates, but he, of course, served both sides. But he died in the battle outside of Atlanta, down in... Yeah, exactly. That's right. And he was a Benedictine. He had come over from Bavaria, and he was with the Abbey up in Pennsylvania. And he had gone to Nashville to serve the German-speaking Catholics in Nashville. And all of those men were conscripted, and so he went in to serve with them as a chaplain. And he was ministering to someone on the battlefield. His head was taken off the Battle of Jonesboro. And it's interesting because he served both sides, but he was sympathetic to the South. And again, he said because he said the South was more sympathetic to Catholicism. So Father Thomas O'Reilly, we have this portrait of him in our lobby. He was there when the city was under siege. He tended to the wounded Confederates. He would actually cross lines and tend to the Union soldiers. And when Sherman wanted to burn the city, he intervened on behalf of the city for, I think he saved like 5 churches and the city hall. And he was pretty adamant that if that didn't happen, that the Catholics in Sherman's army would rise up and rebel. Because it was such a war crime, this whole, what was happening in the South. And Sherman almost killed him, but he didn't. And as they left, they did not burn a few buildings in Atlanta. And even today, Father Thomas O'Reilly is respected in Atlanta as having saved some of those buildings. And we have some of his personal effects in the law. Okay, Bishop Gross, he again is he also was, I believe, a redemptorist, and he wherever the Redemptorists would go, they would bring the devotion to Our Lady of Perpetual Help. They would also bring the 40 hours. He brought that again to Georgia. So this is the shrine of the Immaculate Conception. It's the first church in North Georgia, the first church in what is today Atlanta, Catholic. And the first building that was before this was a frame building, and it was erected in 1851. This building was built later. And Father Thomas O'Reilly was the pastor, and he was actually buried beneath the altar, and they had forgotten that. And in the 1980s, there was a fire. They had to restore it. They found it. And it was like, how do you forget? You've got like 2 priests buried in the basement, but you did. But anyway. One of the interesting things about this parish is that a lot of the old Catholic families in Georgia obviously would go back to this place, those first Catholic families. And one of them are the Mitchells, right? Martha Mitchell. And, but the other one are the Holidays. And you think, where have I heard that term before? Okay, the Holidays were the model for, again, I'm going back to Gone with the Wind, I'm sorry, it's just a piece of fiction, but it modeled so much of this. So if you know that story, Melody Hamilton was the good person in that story. She was like the real saint in that story, besides Miss Ellen. And she was named after a holiday, Melania Holiday. And Melania Holiday was in love with Doc Holiday, who was from Georgia. And so their family records go back to this parish. Melania ended up becoming a nun, which broke Doc Holliday's heart, and he ends up dying out west. But he becomes Catholic, like his family. Even the Melanie Hamilton, Melania Holiday, I mean, it's like the same initials. So another great person that we need to keep in mind is Father Peter Whalen. He was a wonderful Irish priest, and he had been the longest serving pastor at Locust Grove. And his painting, you'll see his painting in that painting of the old church. He's there wearing black vestments for a requiem mass. But he was also called the Angel of Andersonville. So when Georgia was under siege, everything was breaking down. There was no way to get food anywhere. Everybody was starving. Everybody, and the prisoner exchange had stopped. So what had happened was Grant and Sherman, they just stopped doing prisoner exchange. So even if the Confederacy said, we'll give you 5 Union soldiers for 1 Confederate soldier, but they said no. So you had this kind of excessive buildup of prisoners of war that were captured at the battles from Chattanooga down to Chickamauga. And they go to this place that had been created for about 10,000 people, and it ends up being something like 40,000 people in it. And there was just so much, it was just a filthy place. People were dying. It was just an absolute tragedy. And priests and bishops would come, and they would serve for a while, and they'd throw up, and they'd get sick, and they'd have to leave. And God bless Father Peter Whalen. He came, and he just wouldn't leave. And he served them night and day. He lived in a little cabin off to the railings, beyond the wall, and he would go there in the morning, and he would serve till the evening, and he would come back. And he did it for over a year, and until they were basically liberated. And he himself had been a prisoner of war, as in the North. He had been a prisoner of war himself. So, oh my goodness, I'm never going to through all this. Pretty interesting, though. Okay, this is a weird one. Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis never became Catholic. He wanted to. He was actually talked out of becoming Catholic for whatever reason in Savannah, but his children were raised for a while in Savannah, and he had a real love for the Catholic Church. Even as a retired man after he was liberated from prison, he would go to Mass almost every other week, even though he wasn't Catholic. And his daughter, I think, played the organ for the Catholic Church in this little town in Mississippi where he ends up retiring to. And one of the men who comes to visit him is a Catholic priest, and he was treated very poorly, Jefferson Davis. And he was a very cultured man, a very interesting man. And also Pope Pius IX wove for him a crown of thorns and gave it to him. And I think he received 2 of those. I think one of them was received here. The Vatican was very sympathetic to the South, very sympathetic to Jefferson Davis, and the Vatican is one of the few places that really almost even recognize the South as a country. Okay, this is Le Puy, and this is where a lot of our French sisters arrived from. This is Bishop Barreau's hometown. And can you imagine going through this place that was established by Charlemagne to Washington, Wilkes County? But anyway. Some of the priests that are buried in these little cemeteries in these rural places. This fellow by the name of Father Bernard Doyle, he was named for a priest who was his uncle. This man was educated in I think Quebec, a lot of Catholics would send their family to Quebec because you couldn't get into Protestant schools. Even almost 100 years ago, you had to stop. You had to start the Catholic University of America because you couldn't get Catholics into doctorate programs at Yale, Harvard, and Princeton. But he was killed one night as he was actually stationed in Athens. And there was a man dying, and he went to give him last rites. And on the way back, his buggy was washed away and he drowned. And he was their favorite son, obviously, and he drowned and died on the 1-year anniversary of his ordination. Sweet story. There's another story that needs to be told, and that's the Lebanese Catholics. A lot of Lebanese Catholics come and arrive in Georgia, and they're coming, probably more Lebanese people outside of Lebanon than there are in Lebanon. And Georgia's one of those places where they came. And they were mercantilists, mostly, in Georgia. A lot of small towns in Georgia, like LaGrange and Newman, have old Catholic families who are Lebanese. They started some of the parishes in those places. Sacred Heart, this is a wonderful parish in Milledgeville. This is Father Brian Kerr is the pastor there. I think they're about on their 150th anniversary. And next year. And the Marquis de Lafayette stayed in a hotel on the site. That hotel was torn down. They used the same bricks to make this church. Again, just to say, we had a lot of French. And so you have in Charleston and in Savannah the cathedrals of John the Baptist. This is a very old Catholic church in Columbus. Got a good friend who's pastor there. And that was super west. Columbus was like, might as well have been, I don't know, California, when it went in, right? Again, Doc Holliday, he was from Georgia, Catholic family, and he was kissing cousins to Melania Holliday. One of the great families, probably the greatest family in Catholic history in Georgia, is the Ely family. Their mother was African-American slave. Their father was an Irishman. And they had, I think, like 9 children. And they were just probably the most, if you look up the Healy family of Georgia, that's all you have to type in, and you'll get this huge history of these great people. One of them was the second founder of Georgetown. One of them was the first bishop of Maine. One of them worked in the Vatican. One of them was, a rector of major seminary. 2 of them were sisters. Most of these would have been educated in Quebec, because they had to get them out of Georgia to be educated, right? And by law in Georgia, they were technically slaves, but of course they weren't in the eyes of the church. There is a huge Jesuit history in the South, and it's almost all located in Louisiana. Before it was in Louisiana, it was in Georgia. So they were in Macon, Georgia, and that's where they had their novitiate, and they had a university or college there, and they built a beautiful church there, kind of beautiful school there. The school burned down, most everything was lost, and they ended up moving to Louisiana thereafter. The church still stands, St. Joseph, on the hill there in Macon. It's just a splendid, beautiful church. The fire was an accident, but it was a tragic accident. And they lost a lot of very old manuscripts and documents and the library. The first hospital in Atlanta is St. Joseph's Hospital, founded by Catholics, Sisters of Mercy. And they had survived the yellow fever in Savannah, and where everybody else left, those sisters stayed and ministered to the dying. And so they had this really remarkable reputation. And so when they came to Atlanta, people were excited. And so they were very much welcomed. But then, of course, they wanted to treat people of color, and there was problems, and there's a whole history there. But they had a great history in Atlanta. Marist School was the big high school for the young men, and nowadays, you get in trouble if you have a water gun at church, and they used to march around all over downtown Atlanta with M1 rifles. It was a different world back then. But that's now the only thing that's left of that campus is the Basilica of the Sacred Heart. Another great Catholic school, high school in Georgia is the Benedictine School in Savannah. Mother Matilda Beasley is somebody we need to know. She had come from New Orleans, and she had married a Mr. Beasley, a wealthy black man who lived in Savannah. She was an educator of free slaves, and she was a religious leader. She ran an orphanage, and she died on December 20th. She was 71 years old. She was found kneeling in her chapel with her burial clothes and instructions for her funeral laid out beside her. And you can find her grave in Savannah. It's a beautiful place. Just some interesting people. Annie Fitzgerald Stevens, businesswoman, political activist, probably the inspiration for the fictional character Scarlett O'Hara. She was a real estate developer. She actually sued the federal government after General Sherman damaged some of her properties. She was outspoken, contentious, domineering. She rode a buggy by herself to collect rent. And she married Captain John Stevens, who was a member of an old Catholic gentry family from Ireland, who was also who also served as the police commissioner for 6 terms in Atlanta. And this, I think, she is, I want to say, the grandmother of Margaret Mitchell, who was a Fitzgerald. And so this is the mother of Margaret Mitchell. And she, too, was very prestigious Catholic family, and she was educated in Quebec. She established the Catholic Laymen's Association of Georgia. She fought against anti-Catholicism. And she was probably the character for Miss Ellen, inspiration for the character Miss Ellen in Gone with the Wind. And this is Melania. Again, this is the woman who was Doc Holliday's love. When he died out west, they found a note to her amongst his personal things. There were sweet letters between the two of them. The family finally ended up throwing all those away. They just felt they were too personal. Joel Chandler Harris had married a French lady. She was Catholic. He dragged his heels but converted, I think, in the last year of his life. So we count him. He's the collector of the Uncle Remus stories. And you have to understand that there's a lot of anti-Catholicism at the time, so even today it is, but it's not so. It's not rough. It's more sort of. But back then it was bad. if you were Catholic. You couldn't get certain jobs, you couldn't get certain things. There were certain things you could do. You could work in the police force, you know. One of the more interesting things about anti-Catholicism is the KKK hates Catholics. And Atlanta Catholics bought the KKK property and turned it into the Cathedral of Christ the King. And I just love that. This is James Longstreet. I don't know if you know James Longstreet. He fought next to Robert E. Lee. He was a fascinating person. I just think, you know, everybody should know James Longstreet. And he ends up, after the revolution, after the Civil War, he is a friend of Ulysses S. Grant. They're actually kind of related. And you know, he introduced Ulysses S. Grant to, I think, one of his cousins who he marries. And they're old buddies from West Point. And at the end of the Civil War, Longstreet actually becomes a Republican, and you know, he's just shunned from Southern culture because of that. But he ends up being like a diplomat to the Ottoman Empire. He's just got a fascinating life. Even, you know, post-war life, it's just fascinating. But he is in Gainesville, and the little Catholic church in Gainesville starts in his basement because he becomes Catholic. When he dies, Bishop Keeley does the Right Way Mass. And Bishop Keeley had actually been a drummer boy in Longstreet's, one of his army groups and divisions. And Bishop Keeley is also related to Father Tim Petner, if you know Father Tim Petner. His mother, I think, is from there. One of the first African-American missions in the city was started by a Jewish convert, Father Ignatius Listener, and Mother Drexel. And most Catholics did not own a lot of slaves because most Catholics were kind of poor. And really, Southerners didn't own a lot of slaves. You know, it was a very sort of rich families to do that. And when, after the end of the war, a lot of African-American freedmen became the religion of their former masters. So a lot of blacks in Georgia are Protestant because of that. But there was an effort, and still is an effort, to sort of to reach out in some of these inner city areas. Mother Drexel is a great example of someone who loves the Lord and who tries to respond to communities in need. This is a great trailer priest, Monsignor Joseph Cassidy. So, you know, this is like if you live up in the North Georgia mountains, and, you know, he would drag his trailer along and set up the same house outside, and then keep going and say mass somewhere else, and keep going and say mass somewhere else. Just remarkable guy. Our Lady Perpetual Help Home comes. It was a Jewish orphanage. They bought it out and turned it into basically a place to take care of cancer patients. Has been ever since. And they are related to Rose Hawthorne, who was their founder. She was the daughter of the author, the American author, Nathaniel. Some Catholics in Georgia, Margaret Mitchell, we talked about her. She's not a very good Catholic, but she was Catholic. Again, the Archdiocese of Atlanta gets founded. It basically is Georgia above the fall line. Everything beneath is the Diocese of Savannah. One person who becomes Catholic, which surprised me, I don't think he died Catholic, but he became Catholic, was Hank Aaron. Flannery O'Connor, of course, if you know and love literature. This is her home in Savannah, her home in Milledgeville in the city, and her farmhouse, Andalusia, in outside of Milledgeville. Bishop Hiley was very much an interesting person. Again, he he was important in race relations. He ends up becoming the first Catholic prelate to ever visit the House of Parliament after the Reformation. So he was the Bishop of Atlanta, but then he gets moved and he becomes other things. He had come from Philadelphia. He's the one who built Christ the King. So, and Christ the King was initially a co-cathedral, and then it became the cathedral. Bishop Howland, I know we're going way too slow, but I'm sorry. He is important because of, in many ways, the way we worship. He was a strong American advocate for vernacular and the liturgy. He was from Atlanta. When Dr. King received his Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize, Archbishop Paul Hanlon was one who helped to have a reception at I believe the Biltmore in Atlanta. And it was an interesting time because, no white clergy, Protestant clergy, came to that, right? And here was and King, of course, is Baptist, but it's the Archbishop of Atlanta who's helping to organize all that. He's also the one who integrated the Catholic schools. Here's the one that might surprise you. Bobby Jones, deathbed convert. Again, he married a Catholic. And we're probably going to have to wrap up there, but there are so many more. I'll just say some of these. Susan Hayward, she's buried in Georgia. Clarence Thomas, awesome guy. And let's see. Freddie Washington, she's an actress, African-American actress, musician, and she fought for social justice. She's from Atlanta, Catholic. I was here when Mother Teresa came. That's another religious order in Atlanta. We've got the Olympics that bring so many more international people in. You've Gingrich and Stooley, these are Catholics as well. And now there's this southern migration where so many people are moving south. And so it just begs, I think it stands to reason there's a lot more future than there is past in Georgia. A lot of who knows what the Lord's going to do with us and where we're going to go. But I feel good. Anyway, guys, I have to go and I'm running late. But I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you love this.
Good stories.
Just things I want to know otherwise.
Yeah.